You think a mother's love for her son is unbreakable, something you have a right to? I thought so too. In my 61 years on this earth, I've seen my share of betrayal and injustice, but nothing could have prepared me for what my daughter-in-law said. It happened in my garden on a perfect day when I was teaching my 5-year-old grandson, Leo, how to plant flowers. I felt like I was finally living. And just when I thought life had found its simple purpose, she said, "Dorothy, we found a new daycare for Leo. It's more diverse. You're just too white for him." I felt the blood drain from my face. The words felt like poison arrows, each one hitting a different part of my heart. She thought I was just some old woman to be pushed aside. She thought I was powerless. But what she didn't know was that her words had just awakened something in me that would change our family forever. She opened a Pandora's box, not knowing it was a box full of my savings. My name is Dorothy Miller. I'm 61 years old, a widow, and until last week, I thought I was a perfectly sane, normal woman living a perfectly normal, albeit quiet life in a perfectly normal suburb of Chicago. Oh, what an utterly delightful fool I was. I mean, honestly, you get to my age, you think you've seen it all. You've buried a husband, raised a son, survived a few recessions, and mastered the art of making a passable pot roast. You think you've earned a bit of peace and quiet. You really do. But life, as it turns out, has a twisted sense of humor, a knack for pulling the rug out from under you just as you've decided it's finally time to sit down with a cup of tea. The whole thing started, as these ridiculous sagas always do, on a day that felt like a gift. It was a Tuesday, the sort of spring day that smells like freshly cut grass and hope. I was in my garden, knee-deep in soil, a pair of ancient gardening gloves caked with mud, rescuing my prized peonies from a particularly aggressive patch of weeds. My grandson, Leo, was beside me. He's 5 and a whirlwind of energy with his father's deep brown eyes and my late husband's unruly cowlick. He was meticulously, and I mean meticulously, arranging smooth river stones into a tiny, prehistoric-looking pyramid. The sun warmed my back, the birds were chirping. For a fleeting moment, I felt a sense of utter, uncomplicated joy. This, I thought, is what it's all about. This is the simple happiness you spend your whole life chasing. It's in the quiet moments. It's in the dirt under your fingernails. It's in the look of pure concentration on a little boy's face. I looked at him so focused, and a wave of warmth spread through my chest. He was my world. He was the reason I kept going, the little fire of pure, unadulterated love that burned bright in the center of my life. My son, Ethan, and his wife, Brittany, had been struggling with finding a full-time daycare that they felt was up to their standards, a phrase that always felt far too grand for a couple of mid-level project managers. So, a few months ago, I had offered to take on the role of babysitter a couple of days a week. It was a no-brainer. I adored my grandson, and they got a break. It was a win-win situation. Or so I thought. I reached over, gently wiped a smudge of dirt from Leo's cheek with my thumb, and told him he was doing a wonderful job. He smiled, a big, gap-toothed grin that could melt an iceberg. That smile, that moment, was the last time I felt that particular brand of peaceful joy. Just as the thought crossed my mind, Brittany's car pulled up the drive, a gleaming, ridiculous SUV that was far too large for our narrow street. She got out looking as impeccable as ever, not a single strand of her expertly highlighted hair out of place. Her lips were a perfect shade of matte nude, and her face was a mask of polite indifference. "Dorothy," she said, the word a clipped, distant sound, "we need to talk." I pulled myself up, trying to brush the soil off my pants, a foolish, futile gesture. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice cheerful. "What is it?" I expected some mundane complaint about the traffic, or perhaps a passive-aggressive remark about my gardening habits. What she said next was so far beyond the realm of my reality that for a full minute I thought she was joking. She said, "We've decided to enroll Leo in a new daycare. A much better one, a more diverse one." I blinked. The word hung in the air, foreign and sharp. "Diverse?" I asked, my voice a little too high. "I'm not sure I understand, Brittany." She sighed, a small, put-upon exhalation that was clearly meant to show how much of a burden I was being. Look, Dorothy, it's just, you're not what we're looking for. You're too white. The world, which a moment ago had been a sunny, vibrant garden, seemed to fade to a monochrome, blurry print. My brain, that slow-moving, rusty old machine, simply couldn't process the words. Too white. I stood there holding a trowel like a weapon, the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers filling my lungs. I felt a laugh building in my chest, a hysterical, ridiculous sound. This was a joke, right? A terribly insensitive one, but a joke nonetheless. I looked at Brittany, waiting for her to break character, to smile and say, "Got you." But her face remained a perfectly serene, unyielding canvas. "Honey," I said, trying to inject some humor into my voice, "I'm not sure what you mean. I'm an American woman of European descent. I'm as white as they come. I can't exactly change that, can I?" Her eyes, as cold and gray as a winter sky, narrowed slightly. "It's not about changing it, Dorothy. It's about representation. It's about exposing him to different cultures. You can't provide that. You're so suburban and white. You're just so incredibly white." The words felt like little daggers, each one hitting a different part of my heart. Suburban, white. The way she said it, it was a curse, an accusation, as if my heritage, the very skin I was born in, was a fault, a flaw, a reason to be discarded. I looked down at my hands, at the wrinkles and the age spots and the dirt caked under my fingernails for a lifetime of hard work and simple pleasures. For the first time, I saw myself through her eyes, an old white woman with a house in the suburbs, a relic, an embarrassing piece of furniture she wanted to throw out because it didn't match her new modern aesthetic. The irony was thick you could cut it with a knife. A woman of my age, a woman who had volunteered at soup kitchens, who had worked side by side with people from every corner of the globe, was being told she was too insular, too monochrome. It was the most absurd, ridiculous, and frankly offensive thing I had ever heard. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words were stuck in my throat. This wasn't just about babysitting. This was about something much deeper, something ugly and cold and so unfair. It was a rejection, a total, complete, and utterly unwarranted dismissal of my worth. And it came from the person who was married to my son, the person who was the mother of the little boy I loved more than life itself. The unfairness of it all was a physical weight in my chest, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to scream, to laugh, to cry, but all I could do was stand there, holding a trowel, trying to comprehend the sheer lunacy of the situation. This was the moment everything changed, the moment I realized that some battles aren't fought with logic, but with something far more potent. It was also the moment I decided I wouldn't just sit here and let this happen. I was Dorothy Miller, and I wasn't done fighting yet. By the way, if you're finding this story as unbelievable as I am, you'll definitely want to stick around to see how this all unfolds. To make sure you don't miss any of the drama, hit that subscribe button. It's not every day a woman has to go to war over her own race, is it? The silence after Brittany's pronouncement was a living, breathing thing, a vast, empty space where my heart should have been. It hung in the air between us, thicker than the Chicago humidity in July. My brain, that loyal but exhausted servant, finally caught up. Too white? The words echoed, hollow and ridiculous in the cavern of my skull. It wasn't a joke. Her face, a study in bland corporate neutrality, confirmed it. She wasn't being satirical. She was deadly serious. "So," I finally managed, my voice a gravelly whisper, "you're firing me from being a grandmother?" A little muscle in her jaw twitched. "It's not like that, Dorothy. We just feel it's important for Leo to have a more globally aware upbringing. He needs to see a world that isn't just us." She gestured vaguely at my modest two-story home, the neatly trimmed lawn, the cheerful bed of petunias. Her disdain was so palpable it felt like a physical slap. He needs exposure to different cultures, different perspectives. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. And I'm not cultured? The irony was so rich it was practically obscene. I had spent 2 decades as a social worker, working in some of Chicago's most diverse neighborhoods, helping families from every corner of the world. I spoke enough Spanish to be a passable tour guide and could name more countries on a map than she could likely spell. But that wasn't the point, was it? She wasn't talking about my past or my experience. She was talking about my face, my skin, the blood in my veins. Just then, my son Ethan sauntered out from behind the SUV. He was wearing his usual uniform of crisp khakis and a polo shirt, and he held his phone, scrolling as if the conversation was of no more importance than a random ad for a car part. He didn't meet my eyes. He never did when things got difficult. He was the king of avoidance, a master of 1,000 silent retreats. "Mom," he said, without looking up, his voice the same flat tone he used to confirm a dinner reservation. "It's for the best. Brittany's right. The new daycare has an inclusive curriculum. They even have a full-time diversity consultant." He said it like a victory, a proud proclamation that he had found the perfect, progressive solution to a non-existent problem. My heart sank, a heavy stone dropping into a bottomless pit. It wasn't just Brittany. He was in on it. He was a willing participant in my erasure. My son, the little boy I had read bedtime stories to, the teenager I had stayed up all night worrying about, was standing there supporting this preposterous, insulting lie. The rage, which had been a low, simmering flame, suddenly flared into a roaring inferno. "Ethan," I said, my voice low and tight. He finally looked up from his phone, a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "Do you hear what she's saying? Do you hear the words coming out of your wife's mouth? She's saying I'm not good enough for my own grandson because of the color of my skin? That I'm some kind of cultural void?" He shuffled his feet. "Mom, don't be dramatic. It's just semantics. It's about creating a rich environment for Leo." "Semantics?" I nearly shouted. "Semantics? When did it become a problem for a grandmother to love and care for her own grandson? When did that simple act become a racial issue?" Leo, who was being quietly arranging his rocks, looked up, his little brow furrowed with confusion. He saw the anger on my face, the panic in my eyes. "Grandma, are you okay?" That did it. That little voice, that innocent question. The floodgates opened, and the rage gave way to a wave of soul-crushing sadness. He didn't deserve to see this. He was a pure, innocent little boy, and the people who were supposed to love and protect him were weaponizing something as ridiculous as race to justify their own selfishness. I looked at Brittany, at the cruel, unyielding masks she wore. Then I looked at my son, a man I barely recognized, a man who had chosen to be her echo instead of his own person. And in that moment, I knew. They weren't just taking my babysitting duties away, they were trying to take me out of Leo's life entirely. This was a hostage takeover, a calculated attempt to sever my bond with my grandson, all under the guise of cultural enrichment. They weren't talking about exposing him to a rich, diverse world. They were talking about protecting him from me, from my suburban, too white existence. The sheer gall of it all was breathtaking. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, the comfortable, solid world I knew crumbling into dust. But a strange thing happened amidst the despair. A different kind of fire ignited in me, a quiet, determined fury. They thought I could dismiss me, that they could cast me aside like an old book they'd grown tired of. They thought I would just stand here and take it. They were wrong. So very wrong. This wasn't just about a babysitting gig. It was about my love, my family, and the principles I had lived by my entire life. And I wasn't about to let a couple of self-important callous kids redefine my place in my own grandson's world. No, not today and not ever. I took a deep breath, straightened my back, and gave Brittany a cold smile. "You know, dear," I said, my voice dangerously calm. For someone who wants to expose her son to so many different cultures, you seem to have a rather narrow view of what a grandmother can offer. But don't worry, I'll make sure to get all the dirt out of my fingernails. You wouldn't want your new diverse daycare to think your son had been playing in the backyard of some common white woman now, would you? With that, I turned on my heel and walked back into my house, leaving them standing there, bewildered in the quiet, sun-drenched silence of my garden. The door shut behind me with a decisive, final click. And that was the end of Phase 1. The war had just begun. The click of the front door latch was a sound as final as a gavel striking wood. It sealed me inside my house, a sanctuary that felt, in that moment, more like a cage. The silence was immediate and profound, a stark contrast to the buzzing humiliation that had just taken place on my lawn. I stood in the foyer, my heart pounding a frantic, angry rhythm against my ribs. My hands were still caked with garden soil. I stared at them, at the mud and the age spots and the pale, wrinkled skin, and I felt a fresh wave of indignity wash over me. Too white? The sheer, unadulterated stupidity of it was mind-boggling. It was the sort of phrase you'd expect from a spoiled, petulant teenager, not a 30-something woman who considered herself an arbiter of modern social justice. But there it was, a new kind of weapon in a new kind of war, and it had been aimed directly at my heart, at the one thing I loved most, my grandson. I walked through the house, my own home, a place I had spent 40 years making a sanctuary. Every piece of furniture, every photograph on the mantel held a memory. The worn armchair where I'd read bedtime stories to Ethan, the kitchen table where we'd done countless homework assignments. I ran a hand over the smooth, cool surface of the old wooden table. It was more than wood and paint. It was a testament to a life lived, a life built on love and sacrifice and hard work. A life, apparently, that was now considered a liability. My son, the boy I had dedicated my entire existence to, who I had raised to be a good, kind man, he had stood there and let his wife, a woman who had been in his life for all of 5 minutes in the grand scheme of things, dismiss my very being with a flippant, racially charged comment. I wanted to sit down and cry. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rage against the injustice of it all. But I didn't, because I knew, deep down, that tears and screams wouldn't change a thing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a statement of intent. They had made it abundantly clear. I went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hand was shaking. I sat at the table and just stared out the window, looking at my perfectly manicured lawn, the peonies I had just saved from the weeds, the 2 empty cars in the driveway. A silent, perfectly framed tableau of suburban hell. This wasn't about a new daycare. This was about power. This was about control. Brittany wanted to sever any meaningful relationship I had with Leo because I was a link to a past she didn't want him to have. She wanted him to be hers and hers alone, untainted by the suburban and white influence she clearly despised. And Ethan? He was just along for the ride. He'd always been a people pleaser, a chameleon. As a boy, he'd changed his interests to fit in with his friends. As a man, he'd changed his personality to fit in with his wife. The saddest part was, he didn't even seem to see it. He truly believed he was doing the right thing, moving forward, being globally aware. It was a new and frightening kind of delusion, one that hid a simple, ugly truth. They were trying to cut me out of my own family, and I wasn't having it. A quiet, cold resolve settled over me, a chilling sensation that felt a lot like courage. I wasn't going to lie down and let them walk all over me. I wasn't going to let them erase me from Leo's life. They had made their move. Now it was my turn. I thought about what they had said. Too white? It was the most ridiculous thing I had ever heard. The kind of phrase that makes you wonder if you've stepped into an alternate dimension where up is down and black is white.
But it was their weapon, and I was going to use it against them. I had a lifetime of experience working with people. I knew how to read a room, how to find an angle, and how to fight a system that was stacked against you. I had done it for decades, helping families navigate impossible bureaucracies and unfair regulations. Now, I had to use those skills for myself. My first thought was to call a lawyer. But what would I tell them? My daughter-in-law is racist against white people and my son won't talk to me. They would laugh me out of their office. No, this wasn't a legal problem. This was a psychological and social one. It was a game of emotional warfare, and I knew how to play. I stood up and walked into my home office, a small room overflowing with dusty books and old file cabinets. I sat down at my desk, pulled a notepad and a pen toward me, and started to make a list. The first item was simple: reassess my assets. My husband, Robert, had been a smart man. He hadn't been a millionaire, but he had been a shrewd investor. He'd left me the house, of course, but he'd also left me a tidy sum of money and a portfolio of investments that I had always just trusted his old financial advisor to manage. I had never really looked at the numbers, not in any detail. It had felt disrespectful somehow, as if I were questioning his judgment. But now it felt necessary. The second item on the list was just as simple, but far more complicated. Find a new way to connect with Leo. If they weren't going to let me see him in person, I had to find a different way, a better way, a way they couldn't control. My mind raced, the gears turning faster and faster with each passing moment. I had a lot of work to do. They thought they had backed me into a corner, but they had only lit a fire under me. This was a turning point, a moment where I had to decide if I was going to be the victim they wanted me to be or the woman who would fight tooth and nail for her family. I was done being a passive observer in my own life. I was going to take the reins back, and I was going to make them regret the day they ever underestimated me. This was my fight, and I was going to win. I wasn't just doing this for myself anymore. I was doing it for Leo, and I couldn't fail.
The first phone call I made was to Robert's old financial advisor, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had the bedside manner of a tax audit. He was a quiet, unassuming man who had handled our accounts for over 20 years, and in all that time, I'd trusted him implicitly, mostly because Robert had. Now, I felt a strange mixture of shame and fury at my own passivity. "Dorothy, good heavens," he said, his voice a dry, rustling sound over the phone. "I haven't heard from you in months. Is everything all right?" I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "Everything is fine, Mr. Henderson. I'm just reviewing some things. My husband's portfolio. I'd like to get a detailed report on everything. The investments, the cash accounts, the annuities, everything." There was a long pause on the other end, a silence that felt heavier than usual. I could almost hear the little gears turning in his head, a man who was clearly not used to a client like me suddenly taking an interest. "Well, of course, Dorothy," he said, the words carefully chosen. "Is there a specific reason for this sudden review?" I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Let's just say I've been inspired to be more globally aware of my assets. I'll be in your office first thing in the morning." I hung up before he could say another word. It was a small victory, but it felt good. It felt like I was finally in motion. With the first piece of the puzzle in place, I moved on to the second. I opened my laptop, a machine I usually only use for reading news articles and sending emails to my sister, and navigated to social media. I hadn't paid much attention to my son's profile since they had them. I'd click a like on a picture of Leo once in a while, but I didn't follow their day-to-day lives. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed. Or, rather, how much I was meant to miss. I started with Brittany's Instagram, a perfectly curated feed of pastel-filtered photos. There were pictures of Leo in a new designer brand outfit I'd never seen before, photos of their recent baby moon, as she called it, to the Cayman Islands, a picture of them at a ridiculously upscale restaurant with a caption that read, "A little midweek treat for us. We've earned it." My blood ran cold.
They had been complaining about money for months. They said they couldn't afford proper childcare. They had even hinted, ever so subtly, that they needed financial assistance. And all the while, they were living in a world of luxury I hadn't even realized existed. My hand hovered over the keyboard. I felt the slow burn of betrayal deep in my stomach. The too white excuse was a smokescreen, a ridiculously flimsy racist one nonetheless. This was about money. My money. They wanted something from me, and they were trying to cut me out of the picture while they went about their business. The thought was so vile, so insidious, I almost felt sick. I closed her Instagram and went to Ethan's Facebook. He wasn't as active, but a few posts caught my eye. There was a post from a week ago, a photo of a gleaming, brand new sports sedan sitting in their driveway. The caption from Ethan himself read, "Couldn't be prouder to finally get the car of my dreams, thanks to my beautiful wife for believing in me and pushing me to achieve my goals." I stared at the photo, feeling the last vestiges of my hope for my son drain away. This was not the man I had raised. This was a hollowed out imitation, a walking billboard for his wife's vanity and his own greed. He had given me a lecture on global awareness and cultural enrichment, and all the while, he was spending money he didn't have on a car he didn't need, egged on by a woman who saw me as nothing more than a hindrance. The sadness was gone now, replaced with a cold, hard resolve. They had played their hand. They had shown me their cards, and now I had to show them mine. My next call was to my best friend, Martha. We had been friends since college, and she was the only person I felt I could be completely honest with. She picked up on the first ring. "Dorothy, what is it? You sound like you just seen a ghost." I didn't beat around the bush. I told her everything. The garden, the words "too white," the patronizing lecture from my own son, the discovery on social media. I told her how it felt, the betrayal, the anger, the sickening realization that the family I had given my life for was so casually casting me aside. Martha was a listener. She didn't interrupt. When I was done, there was a moment of silence. "Dorothy," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I don't know what to tell you, honey. I'm just speechless. That's vile. They're vile. But I'll tell you this. You were a social worker for 20 years. You are a survivor. You've seen things most people only read about. You know how to fight. You can't let them get away with this. Not just for you, but for that little boy. He needs you." Her words were a lifeline. She was right. I was a survivor. This wasn't the first time I'd been knocked down, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But this time the stakes were higher. I ended the call with a new sense of purpose. I wasn't just fighting for my place anymore. I was fighting for my grandson's right to have a loving, present grandmother. I was fighting for the principles of decency and respect that my son had so easily discarded. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I was just some frail old woman they could push around. But they didn't know the woman they were dealing with. The woman who had to bury her husband and raise her son on her own. The woman who had fought for the downtrodden her entire life. They had no idea, and I was going to make sure they found out. They were about to learn that you don't mess with a woman who has nothing left to lose, especially when that woman has her wits about her. The game was on. This was not just about getting my way. It was about showing them the true meaning of consequences. And I had a feeling they were about to be taught a very harsh lesson. Mr. Henderson's office smelled of old paper and stale coffee, a scent I had always associated with the dull but necessary business of life. I sat in one of the plush, oversized chairs, trying not to get swallowed whole by the dusty upholstery. He was late, of course. Financial advisors, in my experience, always are. Punctuality is a virtue they save for their own profits, not for their clients. When he finally bustled in, his face was a pale shade of green. He avoided my gaze, shuffling a stack of papers on his desk as if they held the secrets of the universe. "Dorothy," he said, his voice a bit more strained than usual. "I apologize for the delay. I've been reviewing your file. It's quite extensive. I smiled, a perfectly polite saccharine smile that didn't reach my eyes. I'm sure it is, Mr. Henderson. My husband was a very thorough man. He was the sort who didn't just walk, he strode with a purpose. And that purpose was always to ensure I would be cared for. The reference to Robert seemed to make him even more uncomfortable. He finally sat, adjusted his tie, and cleared his throat. Dorothy, I think we have a lot to discuss. The report I've compiled for you, it's a bit more comprehensive than I initially expected. I believe you'll find it enlightening. He handed me a thick, spiral-bound report, and my heart gave a little jump. The cover had my name on it, and the total value, which I didn't dare read in his presence, was hidden behind a tab. I thanked him, and he began to speak, his voice a low, dry drone. He talked about diversified portfolios, municipal bonds, and something he called an ironclad annuity. I just listened, not really processing the financial jargon, but waiting for the punchline. I knew Robert had been a good provider. I knew he had left me comfortable. But what Mr. Henderson said next was so surprising that I almost choked on my polite composure. Your late husband was not only an astute investor, Dorothy, but also an incredibly forward-thinking man. He set up several trusts in your name with a specific clause that gives you sole discretion over their distribution. Not only do you have the primary family home, which is fully paid off, but the assets in these accounts have grown exponentially over the past several years. We're talking about a sum that is, well, it's not insignificant, not by any stretch of the imagination. He paused, and for the first time, he looked me dead in the eye, as if expecting me to faint. How not insignificant? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near conspiratorial whisper. Your husband didn't want you to have to worry about anything. He wanted to ensure that you would never have to be a burden on anyone. He wanted you to have a long, happy life, Dorothy. He wanted you to have the freedom to do whatever you pleased for as long as you pleased. He left you with a net worth that is, well, it's not insignificant. Not by any stretch of the imagination. I stared at him, my mind reeling. I had always thought of myself as comfortably middle class. I lived in a comfortable house, I drove a comfortable car, I had a comfortable pension from my social work days. But now he was telling me that I was a millionaire? That the money my son and his wife had been hinting about, the money they had been so obviously coveting, was a drop in the ocean compared to the actual amount? I felt a wave of cold, hard resolve wash over me. This changed everything. This wasn't just about my grandson anymore. This was about something much larger. It was about principle. It was about how a man, my late husband, had spent his life working to ensure I would be safe and secure, and how my son, the boy we had both raised, was now trying to take that away from me under the guise of an excuse so absurd it was almost comical. The anger and the grief and the sense of betrayal, which had been simmering for days, suddenly coalesced into a single razor-sharp point of clarity. They wanted to take something from me that they didn't even know I had. They wanted to take my freedom, to make me dependent on them, and they were using my age and my race as a tool to do it. But they had no idea. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As Mr. Henderson continued to drone on, his voice a pleasant hum in the background, I looked at the cover of the report. The number was there, tucked away behind the tab, a quiet testament to a lifetime of hard work and a promise that had been kept. My husband had not only left me financially secure, but he had also left me with the perfect weapon, a weapon I could now use to fight back. They thought they had backed me into a corner, but they had only given me the means to build my own kingdom. This was no longer just a personal slight. It was a battle for my dignity, and I had just been given the ultimate ammunition. I smiled to myself. They had no idea what was coming. This was just the beginning. Stepping out of Mr. Henderson's office and back onto the bustling Chicago sidewalk was like entering a different world. The city's noise, the screech of a train, the blare of a taxi horn, the chatter of 1,000 strangers, all of it felt different. It was the same city, but I was a different woman. I clutched the thick report to my chest, the paper and ink testament to Robert's quiet love and my newfound power. I had walked into that office feeling like a discarded antique. I walked out feeling like a force of nature. I had the means, and now I had to find a way. My mind, once clouded with grief and confusion, was now a machine, calculating and strategic. They had used emotional manipulation to try and take me out of the game. Now I was going to use financial leverage to get back in. And not just get back in, I was going to change the rules of the game entirely. My first thought was to march right over to their little rental and demand an explanation. But that was the old me. The new me was more patient, more devious. The new me knew that the best revenge is a dish served cold, and that the best way to get a reaction from a couple of aspiring social climbers is to hit them where it hurts the most, their wallet. The sheer arrogance of it all was still breathtaking. They had lectured me on my whiteness and my suburban existence, as if I were some kind of embarrassing stain on their polished, progressive lives. All the while, they were living a life of quiet desperation, complaining about money and hinting at needing help while they flaunted expensive cars and vacations. They didn't want to connect with me. They wanted to drain me dry. And they had no idea that I was the one holding the fire hose. I walked for blocks, my legs carrying me with a renewed purpose. I passed a florist, a little shop filled with the scent of lilies and roses, and something in me broke a little. I had wanted to buy flowers for Leo's room, just a small gesture to remind him that his grandma was thinking of him. But now that felt like a foolish, naive thing to do. This wasn't a time for flowers. This was a time for action. This was a time for steel. They had chosen to make this a war, and they had chosen the battlefield. And I was now a general with an entire army at my disposal. I knew my next step. It wasn't to talk to a lawyer about my family drama. It was to talk to a real estate agent. I had to get my affairs in order, not just for myself, but for the future. And a big part of that was showing them exactly what it felt like to be on the outside, looking in. They thought my house was just a place for them to stay when they couldn't be bothered with a hotel. They thought it was an asset they could eventually inherit. They thought I was a resource to be exploited, not a person to be loved. And they were about to learn how very, very wrong they were. Later that afternoon, I sat in my home office, the same place where I had made my initial list. This time, I was working with a new set of data, a new understanding of my own resources. I pulled up the tax records for my house, the property deeds, and every last scrap of information I could find. I was a detective again, digging for clues in the wreckage of a family I had thought I knew. I found old receipts, bank statements before the trusts were set up, and even a copy of Robert's last will and testament, which he had updated just a few months before he passed. He hadn't just left me everything. He had left me with a specific, legally binding note that read, "To be used for Dorothy's happiness and security in any way she sees fit. My son, Ethan, is a good boy, but I fear he will be easily influenced. Do what you need to do, my dear. I trust you." A wave of emotion, so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. He had known. He had seen it coming. He had known that Ethan was easily manipulated, and he had given me the tools to fight back. It was like he was still there with me, a ghost of a man who had planned for every contingency, even his own death. I smiled, a real, genuine, but slightly unhinged smile. The game was on. They thought they had me. They thought I was an old woman, an easy target, too fragile to fight back. They thought they could use my love for my grandson as a weapon against me. But they had no idea. They had no idea that I had a secret weapon, a little trick up my sleeve, a quiet, powerful plan that was about to unfold. They had no idea that I was about to use their own arrogance against them, and when it was all over, they would understand that family isn't about blood, it's about respect, and they were about to be taught a very painful lesson on both. This wasn't just my story. It was a story about every mother who had been underestimated, every woman who had ever been told she was too old, too anything to fight for her own life. And I was going to make sure the world saw it. They thought I was just some suburban white woman they could push around. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and I couldn't wait to show them. The morning I called the real estate agent felt like a turning point. Her name was Sandra, and she had the kind of polished, no-nonsense demeanor you'd expect from a woman who sold multi-million-dollar properties. I explained my situation with an almost clinical detachment. "My husband passed away a few years ago," I said, my voice as steady as a stone, "and I've decided it's time to sell the family home and move on to something different." She was sympathetic, of course. They always are. It's part of the job. But when she saw the house, the impeccable landscaping, the freshly painted porch, the polished hardwood floors, her professional facade cracked just a little. "Dorothy," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration, "this place is immaculate. It's a seller's dream. We'll have no trouble getting offers." I simply smiled and nodded, a private thought blooming in my mind. She had no idea the offers I was truly interested in. The next few days were a blur of activity. A photographer came and took pictures, each shot a perfect, sanitized image of a life that was now just a memory. The house looked like a magazine ad. The light was just so, the furniture was just so. It was beautiful, but it wasn't mine anymore. It was a product, a commodity. The final indignity, or so I thought at the time, was the "for sale" sign, a big white and red placard planted right in the middle of my perfectly manicured lawn, a silent declaration to the world that this chapter was closing. I stood at my front window, a cup of tea in my hand, and watched as the sign was hammered into the ground. It was an unmistakable message, one I was sure my son and his wife wouldn't miss. I didn't have to wait long. The phone rang that very evening, just as I was about to sit down for a quiet dinner. The caller ID was Ethan. I let it ring twice before I picked it up. My voice was calm, a stark contrast to the thundering in my chest. "Hello, Ethan." "Mom, what in the world is going on?" His voice was high, strained, and filled with a frantic panic I had never heard before. There was no greeting, no politeness, just pure, unadulterated shock. "What do you mean, honey?" I asked, feigning innocence. "The for sale sign, Mom. Are you serious? You can't just sell the house. What are you doing?" The indignation in his voice was so thick I could practically taste it. "You didn't even talk to me about this." My calm demeanor gave way to a slow, deliberate sense of satisfaction. "Didn't I, dear?" I said, a hint of sarcasm creeping into my tone. "I thought we had a conversation just last week about my place in the world. You and Brittany made it quite clear that this suburban, too white environment wasn't working for my grandson. I took your advice. I decided to get more globally aware. What better way to do that than to sell the house and invest in a new, more diverse lifestyle?" Silence. A long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could almost picture him, mouth agape, his phone clutched in a trembling hand. Finally, Brittany's voice cut in, sharp and accusatory. "Dorothy, don't be ridiculous. That's not what we meant, and you know it. We were talking about Leo's exposure, not you selling the house we all assumed would be ours." The audacity of her statement was breathtaking, the sheer entitlement. "Oh, but it is what you meant," I said, my voice like ice. "You were quite clear. And you know, a lifelong social worker doesn't miss the subtle cues. You wanted me out of Leo's life, and you used my race as the reason. Well, now I'm using your hypocrisy as the reason to make a fresh start. Don't worry, I won't be a burden on you anymore. I'll be able to afford my own diverse and inclusive community. After all, you taught me so much about the importance of those things. Ethan stammered, his usual placating demeanor gone. Mom, please, let's talk about this. This is crazy. You can't just give away our inheritance. The word inheritance hung in the air, a final ugly admission. This was what it was all about. It wasn't about Leo or diversity or culture. It was about money. It was always about the money. I felt a wave of cold fury wash over me. Our inheritance, I said, my voice a dangerous whisper. Ethan, your father and I worked our entire lives for this house. This is not an inheritance. This is my property, and I can do whatever I please with it. He tried to argue, to plead, to guilt-trip me, but I didn't listen. I was done with that. I had given them a lifetime of love and support, and they repaid me with lies and racial slurs and a sense of entitlement so vast it was almost a physical thing. Goodbye, Ethan, and I hung up the phone. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the house a comfort. I had just taken the most significant step of my life, a step that would change everything, and I didn't feel a single ounce of regret. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they could use my love for my grandson as a weakness. They had no idea that they had just given me the motivation I needed to fight back. This was just the beginning, and I had a feeling the next act of this play was going to be even more delicious. They had thought their lies and their condescension would make me small, but they had only made me stronger.
The knock on my door was not a friendly tap. It was a series of loud, frantic pounds that rattled the windows and sent a shiver down my spine. I knew who it was. The moment I had hung up the phone with Ethan, I knew they would come. They weren't the type to sit on their feelings, especially when those feelings were born of pure entitlement and righteous indignation. They were a force of emotional chaos, and I was the eye of the storm. I walked to the door, took a deep, steadying breath, and opened it. Ethan stood there, his face a mask of furious disbelief, his polo shirt looking rumpled for the first time in his life. Behind him, Brittany's face was a pale, tight knot of rage. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the venom in our eyes. "Mom," Ethan began, his voice dangerously low. "What is wrong with you? Selling the house? This is our family home, our inheritance. You can't do this." He stepped forward as if to barge in, but I held my ground. "It seems I can, dear," I said, my voice eerily calm. "As I told you, I'm simply looking for a more globally aware living situation. You both thought it was so important for Leo, so I've decided it's important for me too." Brittany shoved past Ethan, her face contorted in a sneer. "Don't play games with us, Dorothy. This is blackmail. You're just trying to manipulate us into giving you what you want. You're a horrible, selfish old woman who doesn't care about her own family." A sharp, cutting laugh escaped me, a sound that was full of the bitter truth. "Selfish? I think we both know who the selfish ones are here, Brittany. I've given my entire life to my family. I have done nothing but love and support my son, and my husband worked his entire life to ensure that I would be secure. And how did you two repay that? By calling me too white to be in my own grandson's life? By treating me like some kind of disposable asset while you prance around on exotic vacations and buy luxury cars?" My voice was rising now, and the years of pent-up indignation were finally finding a release. Ethan's face went white. He knew I had seen the pictures. He knew that the flimsy excuse they had used was nothing more than a cover for their own avarice. "Mom, please, this is an overreaction. It's just a house. We can work something out." "Work something out?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash on my tongue. "You wanted to work something out when you took away my right to be a grandmother? You wanted to work something out when you used a racial slur against your own son's mother?
No, Ethan, this is not about working something out. This is about consequences. He looked at Brittany, a desperate plea for help in his eyes. But she was too far gone. You're just a spiteful, lonely old woman. You'll regret this. We'll make sure you regret this. I took a single step back, a gesture that was both physical and symbolic. I was putting distance between myself and their petty little war. I don't think so, Brittany, I said, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across my face. You see, you and Ethan made a series of assumptions. You assumed that the house was my only asset. You assumed that I was some kind of helpless, frail victim. And most importantly, you assumed that I was so desperate for your love and your approval that I would give you whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted it. I pulled the thick spiral-bound report from behind my back and held it up, a silent, powerful weapon. This is a report from my financial advisor. It turns out that my husband was a lot more forward-thinking than you gave him credit for. He left me with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever having to be a burden on anyone. Not only am I selling this house, but I am doing it on my own terms. I don't need your permission, I don't need your blessing, and I certainly don't need your inheritance. The look on their faces was a masterpiece. Their anger, their entitlement, their self-righteousness, all of it drained away in an instant, replaced with a raw, naked horror. They had spent months, maybe even years, planning for this moment. They had manipulated me, insulted me, and tried to cut me out of my own family, all for a house and a handful of cash they thought they could get their hands on. And now, in a single moment, they realized that the joke was on them. I was not the poor old woman they thought I was. I was a millionaire. They stared at me, their faces pale, their mouths agape. You're a millionaire?" Ethan finally whispered, the words barely audible. I simply smiled, a genuine, joyful smile. "I am, dear. But don't worry. I'm sure you and Brittany will figure out a way to live without your inheritance. After all, you have that beautiful new car, don't you? And you're so globally aware. I'm sure you'll be just fine." I watched them, the pathetic little entitled couple they were. They had thought they were so clever, so ruthless. They had thought they had won. But they had just lost everything. They stood there, utterly defeated, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of utter and profound peace. They had lit a fire, and now they were going to get burned, and I couldn't wait to watch it happen.
The week following the confrontation was a quiet symphony of small, satisfying victories. The phone, once a source of constant frustration, now remains silent save for the occasional call from Sandra, the real estate agent, with updates about potential buyers. She told me the open house had been a resounding success. "Multiple offers, Dorothy," she'd say, her voice bubbling with excitement. "People love the garden and the light. They say it feels homey." I just smile and say, "That's good to hear, Sandra. Let's just take the best offer, shall we?" I didn't care about the money anymore, not in the way they did. The money was just a tool, a means to an end. It was the key that had unlocked my cage. And the silence from Ethan and Brittany was the most delicious thing of all. I knew they were stewing. I knew they were in a state of absolute panic. Their carefully constructed narrative of the dutiful son and the progressive, financially conscious daughter-in-law had come crashing down. I had pulled the rug out from under their feet, and they had landed with a resounding thud. They had sent a few desperate, rambling text messages, a frantic blend of apologies and veiled threats, but I had simply deleted them without a single flicker of emotion. They had made their choice. They had chosen greed and entitlement over love and family, and they were now learning the hard way what that choice cost. My days were filled with a new kind of purpose. I was a woman on a mission, and that mission was to not only secure my future, but to ensure my grandson's future was protected from their avarice.
I met with a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in estate planning and family trusts. I explained my situation with the same cold, detached calm I had used with Mr. Anderson. She listened, her face betraying no emotion. And when I was done, she simply said, "So, you want to set up a trust that your son and daughter-in-law cannot touch, that will benefit your grandson with a stipulation that it's to be managed by an independent third party." I smiled. Exactly. And I want to do it in a way that they will find out about it, but not be able to do a single thing about it. She gave me a small, approving smile. "I think we can arrange that, Dorothy. This is not the first time I've seen a situation like this, though it is one of the more creative solutions I've witnessed." The word creative felt like a badge of honor. I also found a way to reconnect with my grandson. I was not going to let them win. I knew I couldn't just go to their house, but I knew the name of his new daycare. I had written it down, a small, tiny piece of information that felt like a lifeline. I called the director and arranged for a meeting. I told her I was Leo's grandmother and that I wanted to be a part of his life, but that I was estranged from his parents. I didn't lie. I just left out the more incendiary details. The director, a kind older woman, was more than happy to help. She told me about the daycare's policy on family involvement and offered me the opportunity to volunteer there a few hours a week. My heart, which had been a cold, hard stone for weeks, suddenly felt as if it were thawing. I had a way back in. A way to be with my grandson, a way to be a presence in his life that had nothing to do with Ethan or Brittany. They couldn't gatekeep my love for him. They couldn't control my access to his joy. The first day I volunteered, I saw him from across the playground. He was on the swings, a look of pure, unadulterated happiness on his face. When he saw me, his eyes lit up and he ran to me, his little arms outstretched. "Grandma!" he shouted, a sound so full of love it brought tears to my eyes. I hugged him tight, breathing in the scent of sunshine and childhood. I knew then that all the money, all the power, all the vindication in the world was meaningless without this. This was the real win. This was the prize I had been fighting for all along. They had tried to erase me from his life, but they had failed. Miserably. Because love, unlike money, could not be controlled or manipulated. It was a force of its own, and it was going to win in the end. This was not just about getting my revenge. It was about rebuilding my life on my own terms. And this time, I wasn't just doing it for me. I was doing it for him. They had no idea that they had just given me a brand new purpose, and I was going to use it to create a world for my grandson that they could only dream of. A world full of love, a world full of kindness, and a world where no one was too white to be a grandmother. The final chapter of this story was just beginning, and I had a feeling it was going to be the most beautiful one yet. The final act of my little family drama unfolded on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day that felt like a fresh start. The house was empty now, save for the few boxes I'd kept for myself. The buyers, a young family from the city who said they fell in love with the good energy of the place, had paid over the asking price. I smiled to myself. Good energy. The irony was not lost on me. I had a feeling the new owners would be adding a lot more good energy than my son and his wife ever could. The closing was simple, and as I signed the last document, a wave of profound relief washed over me. The house, my home for 40 years, was now a beautiful, closed chapter. It wasn't a source of resentment or expectation anymore. It was just a memory, and a very, very profitable one at that. I used a small portion of the money to buy a lovely 2-bedroom condo in a vibrant neighborhood not far from my old home. It was in a complex with a diverse group of people from all walks of life, and I had already made friends with a kind woman from Brazil who insisted on teaching me how to make her famous feijoada. I was living my own globally aware life, and it was 1,000 times more genuine and fulfilling than the hollow existence my son and his wife had been performing. I also set up the trust for Leo, a move that felt like the most important thing I had ever done. It was an irrevocable trust, structured so that only an independent third party could manage it, and it could not be touched by anyone, not even Leo, until he was 30. This was my final, ultimate gift to him. A gift that would ensure that no one, not his parents, and not their greed, would ever be able to use him as a pawn. It was a secret, of course, for now, but it was a secret I was happy to keep. The public part of my victory, however, was about to begin. I didn't want to go to the media and air all my dirty laundry, but I wanted the truth to be out there. So I did something a little more subtle. I wrote a long, heartfelt essay about a mother's love for her grandson and how a family's love could be corrupted by greed and a twisted sense of entitlement. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. I simply spoke about my experiences and the heartbreaking moment when my family tried to use my age and my race as an excuse to cut me out of my own life. I published the essay on a blog and posted it to my social media accounts, the ones I had been too busy to use until now. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My story went viral. It was shared by thousands of people, most of them mothers and grandmothers who had faced similar situations. My experience became a symbol of a deeper, more profound injustice, a story of an older woman fighting back against a new kind of prejudice. The phone, which had been silent for so long, finally began to ring. It wasn't just a ring. It was a desperate, incessant ringing. Ethan and Brittany, they had seen the essay. They knew. They tried to call, to text, to reason with me, to apologize, to threaten. I ignored it all. Their public image was crumbling, and there wasn't a single thing I could do to help them. I simply let the phones ring and let the messages pile up. I had given them their chance. I had offered them a path of decency and respect. They had chosen to go to war, and they had chosen to lose. They had no idea that they had just given me a platform, a new purpose, and a new way to connect with the world. The final moment of my story came a few weeks later. I was volunteering at Leo's daycare, helping the children with a little art project. I was happy, truly happy. My hands, which had once been caked with mud, were now smudged with finger paint. He came up to me, his little face serious. "Grandma," he said, his voice full of the honest curiosity of a 5-year-old, "my mommy and daddy are sad." I looked at him, and my heart ached, not for them, but for him. "Sometimes, honey," I said, a little note of melancholy in my voice, "people make choices that make them sad. But it's not your fault, and it's not your problem. You just have to be happy, okay?" He nodded, a little shadow of understanding in his eyes. He didn't need to know the whole story. He just needed to know that his grandma was there, that she loved him, and that she wasn't going anywhere. I knew in that moment that I had won. My victory wasn't about the money or the humiliation. It was about the peace in my heart and the love in my life. It was about standing up for myself and for my grandson. It was about proving that my story wasn't over just because I had reached a certain age. It had just begun. And for anyone else out there who's been told they're too white, too old, or too anything to be a part of their own life, I hope this story gives you the courage to fight back, because you have more power than you know, and when you decide to use it, you might just be surprised at what you can achieve.